So, for a few years now, I've thought of myself as a bit of an ethical vegan, but not really a vegan. What I mean by that is there's lots of things about eating meat and dairy products which are a bit jarring to me, but I've never been able to make that shift from eating a omnivore diet over to a mainly plant-based diet. So, in this episode, I want to explore some more about that. Why we continue to eat animal products, what the cultural significance of that is, where our historic drivers come from. We live in a world where eating meat seems like the default. And as you will know from my previous episodes, I don't like living by the defaults. I want to challenge things and see whether or not I like them to make up my own mind. So in this episode, I want to cover some of the historical stuff to do with eating meat and animal products. I want to cover off some of the myths around nutrition and why I've previously been blocked from moving to a more plant-based diet. And I want to play around with the idea of cultural biases and the impact that that has on the way that we think about things. So let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Differently, a podcast designed to take an idea, pull it apart, and challenge the way that we think about it. I'm your host, Andy Franklin, and I'll be your guide through this sometimes wandering journey of exploration, which will hopefully leave you with more questions than answers and a lot to think about. So before I start talking about this properly, I just want to acknowledge that this is a really emotive subject for a lot of people. It feels like there's definitely a binary divide between people who wholeheartedly believe something and people who wholeheartedly don't. So as always, I just want to highlight that the reason that I'm doing this podcast is to bring things up into our awareness, to challenge them and decide how we all think about them in our individual lives based on our own individual values and ideals. I am definitely never saying that my opinion is the right opinion or that there is a truth and that I know the truth. I'm just playing with ideas and everybody hopefully will come to their own conclusions. I'm not here to give you your answers. I'm just here to ask some questions and hopefully create a catalyst that makes you question things as well to decide where you sit about the whole thing. So first off, I want to play with the idea of how we got to the point that we're at with society and how we view eating meat, especially, and dairy products. Doing some research, it looks like we started eating meat hundreds of thousands of years ago because we realized that meat was a calorie and protein dense source of nutrition and it was easier. And then with the advent of cooking the meat to make it easily digestible and tools and weapons and things like that, it moved us more towards a meat-based diet. Having said that, I think meat was still most definitely a celebration. It was a thing that you got every so often, and you had to put a lot of effort into getting that thing. I remember reading The Comfort Crisis recently, where in that book he was talking about hunting, but the hunting wasn't just that they went out and killed an animal. It was 3 or 4 days of trekking over terrain, tracking a pack of deer, and then identifying which one was the weakest member, the oldest member of the pack, which helps to cull the herd and keep the herd strong so they're not slowed down by their weakest member. And then after they killed it, they then had to prepare all of the meat and then carry huge bags of meat back with them. So I think one of the jarring things for me is just that juxtaposition between celebrating the animal and the sustenance that it might give you and putting in the hard work and making sure that it's the right animal at the right time and all of those kind of things, with the ultra processed factory farming method that we have today, where we are literally growing animals for the sake of killing them so we can eat it. I think that bit is the bit that really jars with me personally. And then I tried to think about why, as a society, we've put so much emphasis on eating meat, why eating meat is the default path, whereas, or at least in Western culture, whereas in other cultures it's not quite as prominent. And I think that might have something to do with wealth or the display of wealth. I think if I was going to suggest a hypothesis around why it became so prominent, it would be because meat was a sign of wealth. If you owned land and you could go hunting and you didn't have to work, then you could eat meat all of the time. And it was this big deal, and it proved that you were wealthy and that your status was really high. I remember there's a quote in the musical Assassins by Stephen Sondheim where they're talking about one of the prime ministers, and they say with incredulity, nope, I'm not going to get that word out. And they say with amazement that the one president's favorite food is beef because he's so round and wealthy and prosperous. But I think what we might have done as a society is we might have taken something that was a sign of wealth and then reduced it down to the point where it's in abundance, and then still kind of backwardsly see it as a sign of wealth. So there's this kind of block between what we all know to be true as humans around the idea of not doing anything any harm unless it's necessary and not killing things, which I think we can all agree is something that everybody in society tries to live by. And I think that becomes more evident if you actually ever asked someone to kill their own meat in order to eat it. It would be really jarring because we've abstracted that part of the process away in order to make it easier for us to get the reward without the sacrifice. And then challenging for me why it's so difficult to quit this narrative. As I said at the beginning, I've been an ethical vegan for a couple of years now, which kind of means that I've been having these ideas and been struggling with this cognitive dissonance around eating meat every day, but still feeling a bit icky about the whole process. And I think there's a couple of things at play there. There's the nutrient value and how much protein you can get out of plant-based sources, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, because for me, who is really kind of focused on exercise and fueling my body in the right way, I've always had a bit of a block in that area. But I think the other thing is possibly a biological thing, in that our brains are naturally wired for scarcity. So if there is something that our bodies know will give us an incredible kind of energy-rich, protein-dense source, then we will eat it as much as we can. And I think that works fine if our desire and the abundance of the things are kind of balanced out. But now, because meat is so accessible, because we have turned it into this factory model where it's more about making the most amount of money possible, our bodies and our brains haven't really caught up with that in a way to realize that we need to add a level of restraint into that process rather than just eating it because it's there. I think the same goes for like sugar and other calorie-dense foods that we as a society struggle not to eat because we're not really programmed to not eat things that will sustain us. I heard something interesting recently about the fact that we as humans are the only mammals who are able to cognitively bypass our own nature and choose different options. Any other animal left to its own devices will just do what nature expects. It will use its body to drive its behavior. And we're the only mammals who are actually capable of saying, this might be the thing that my body is telling me to do, but I'm going to choose a different path, which is really interesting. So let's get on to this idea of nutrition. So I, being in the kind of exercise world for a really long time, have lived by this bro science methodology, I guess, of having to eat somewhere between 1.5 and 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight in order to build muscle and maintain muscle mass. And I think one of my challenges with the idea of a plant-based or a mainly plant-based diet was that I wouldn't be able to get enough protein in order to sustain my exercise levels and my physique and the muscle that I've spent 25 years building. But when I actually dug into the research of it, there's a couple of things that stand out to me. So number one is that according to the health world, men only need about 55 grams of protein per day as a maintenance level, and women even less than that. So it's about 0.75 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So on average, it works out at about 55 grams for men and about 45 grams for women. Obviously, if you're an average size, and I don't think average size exists, but we'll bypass that. You'd need to do the maths for yourself. So for me, it works out at about 60 grams of protein that I need as a maintenance level per day, not the 120 to 150 grams that I was aiming for previously. Now, that's if I'm not trying to build muscle, and I don't really know how it would impact the muscle that I have moving forwards if I cut out 50% of my protein intake. But I think it would be interesting to do that experiment and then potentially see what the impacts were rather than just making an assumption based on somebody else's science. I really like the idea in principle of taking scientific studies, but then actually really applying them to you as a person. There's a fundamental flaw with the way that we do peer-reviewed studies in science, which is that we take a huge group of people, we remove as many of the variances in that group of people as we can, and then we test out a process on that group of people to see whether it's applicable to the general population. But the problem with that is there is no general population to apply that premise to if that premise becomes statistically significant. You always have to bring it out of the abstract and put it back into the mainstream, where people and their individual biology and the way that they react to certain things has an impact. Now, that's not me saying that the way that we do medical research is wrong or that the whole system is flawed and you shouldn't believe any of the medical studies. I think it's a great place to start with that. And I think you have to have these kind of peer-reviewed studies as a start point, because otherwise people could just make up any old crap and then you could believe it and it wouldn't necessarily make sense. It wouldn't be objectively true for the general population. But I do think there is a step further that we need to understand and we need to go when it comes to the recommendations and the things that work as a general population, which is to then take those things and apply them to yourself and pay attention. Use yourself as a one-person case study. Pay attention to whether or not those things actually make a difference to you personally. And if they do, then brilliant. And if they don't, then you were not ever going to be one of those people that it applied to. It's a bit of an aside, but I think it's important for me to understand that nuance, because whether or not 1.5 to 2 grams of protein might be the optimum range for most people doesn't necessarily mean that that's the optimum range for me. And I think I need to do my own experimentation into how much protein I need on a day-to-day basis in order to maintain, using the information that's out there as a kind of guideline. The other thing that I struggled with a little bit with the protein is this idea that plant-based proteins don't have the full 9 amino acids that you need in order to create a fully fledged protein. I don't know what the right terminology is for that. And so you have to eat a more diverse diet, and meat is a lot easier. But again, when I actually dug into the research on that, it's not that all of the different amino acids aren't available within plant-based foods. It's just that you have to go to more plant-based foods because one of them will be missing a certain branched chain amino acid, and so you have to get it from somewhere else. And I think that's absolutely fine. And there's lots of people out there that have done much better research than the Googling that I did in terms of working out what those combinations need to be in order to get all of the protein that you need for all of the branched chain amino acids. But from my brief research, it seemed like if you added a starchy, wholemeal, whole wheat carbohydrate with one of your more obvious plant-based protein sources, so edamames, chickpeas, beans, things like that, if you added something like brown pitta or whole grain rice or something, it tended to put those jigsaw pieces together in a way that would give you a fully rich and fully formed protein. And then there's the other things that are really interesting about animal-based nutrition, which when you get into the weird history of these things, it then becomes astounding that we are in the place that we're at. I'm going to use milk as an example because although I have milk in my coffee, I normally have milk on my cereal, I have milk in tea throughout the day. Milk is one of those things that for me has always been just an absolutely bizarre and weird concept. The idea that a cow is a natural replacement for human milk in some way, and that they potentially give these cows extra hormones so they continue to create and produce the milk that we then drain out of them so we can drink it because of its nutrient benefits, is just really odd. I don't know how else to say that it's weird, but I think if you actually just pause for a second and think about how bizarre it is that we would take milk out of another animal that it's producing in order to feed its own young and then drink it for ourselves is bizarre. And then the other thing about milk is that because of the big advertising push around milk being a good source of calcium, now people think that milk is the best source of calcium when actually it's really not. Most of your fibrous green veg has more calcium in it than milk does. But there's something, at least cognitively for me, about milk being white and calcium being white that links those two things together in a way that eating an extra stem of broccoli probably wouldn't. And then even the idea that in order to counterbalance that from a plant-based point of view, what we're trying to do is create things that are like milk but aren't milk. So almond milk and oat milk and things like that. And from what I've heard anecdotally, although I didn't do the research on this bit, those kind of milk alternatives are also incredibly bad for the environment just based on the amount of water that needs to be used in order to create something that looks a bit like milk, so people are more likely to switch from a dairy milk to a milk alternative, when actually I think it would probably be better to shift our cognitive mindset to think that maybe we just don't have things with milk. Coffee is fine to drink black as long as you get used to it. So is tea. There are other fatty things that you can potentially put into those drinks to give you the same mouthfeel if they're too bitter and harsh without that. But again, it feels like we are trying to solve the problem of the fact that we're reliant on milk by creating another solution rather than just taking it back to its source level and saying, do we need milk? And if we don't need milk, then let's stop drinking it. Then we get on to the ethical and environmental dilemmas of eating a lot of meat. So there's this idea that I found called moral relativism. That's right, moral relativism, which is the idea that there is no inherently good or bad thing. It's just that we have to judge people based on their actions and based on the societal expectations. I'm not sure I absolutely agree with that. I think there are some things that as a human species we know to be good or bad. I'm not saying that the animals versus plant-based debate falls into that. I don't know if I agree that that's a society-driven thing, but I can definitely see how that plays out in other areas. There's a reason that anytime you watch an old film or you go and investigate something that was created 500 years ago, the morals around that piece of information are completely different to the morals that we hold today. The example that comes to mind is the idea that in Romeo and Juliet, the Shakespeare play, at the time that he was writing it, I think Juliet was meant to be about 14 years old and Romeo was meant to be about 40. So, whereas today that's completely absurd and we kind of know that to not be right, the society of the time didn't see a problem with that. Hi, so just a quick interlude. It's Editing Andy here. So I thought I'd go and check on that fact because sometimes I do this thing that my wife calls Andy facts, which are facts that I deliver as true, but actually probably don't have much basis in reality. So I have no idea where that Romeo and Juliet fact came from, but I double checked it and it's not right. There is still a weird age gap. So I think from reading a couple of different posts, there is an idea that Juliet is 13 and going to be 14 in a couple of weeks, and Romeo is somewhere like 17 or 18, and then Paris, the guy that she's meant to marry, is probably in his 20s, but it never really says, although he could be anywhere from 18 all the way up to like in his 50s or 60s, because the age gap between Lady Capulet and her husband is that she's in her late 20s and he's in his 50s or 60s. So a complete aside and completely irrelevant to everything that we're talking about, but I just wanted to clear that up. I think I've gone off topic a bit again, but I think the point that I was trying to make with the moral relativism idea is that actually a lot of the time we know something societally to be jarring, and so instead of going back and solving the issue, what we actually do is we abstract it to a point where we no longer have to think about it, so we don't have to deal with the cognitive dissonance that it creates within us. So, for example, we eat meat, but we don't kill the meat ourselves. We are aware that there are better and worse ways to treat the animals before they die and during the killing process. And yet we tend to, as a whole, dismiss that when we're buying meat because the ones who are treated better, the animals who are treated better throughout their lives, tend to be more expensive. And unfortunately, we prioritize other things over that. And even the animals who are treated in the best way possible are still not living a free and easy life, up to the point where one of them is killed in the more hunting description of the way that animals are, the way that meat is produced now, as opposed to years ago when we used to eat it. There's this idea that tends to run through threads around people against the idea of veganism or plant-based diets, which is that we are the apex predator, and therefore we should be able to kill and eat whatever we want, and that we're just kind of living out our natural path. And I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think although something is possible for us to do, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing for us to do, both in terms of us personally, but also us as a society. So there's the ethical treatment of the animals that we are now putting into factory farming, but then there's also the environmental costs that are associated with producing animals at this kind of scale. There was one stat that I read that said that 14% of all of the methane emissions on our planet, which contribute towards global warming, are from the farming industry, the animal farming industry. And again, that's something that's so abstract that it's difficult to feel like we can apply it to whether or not we have chicken or beans for dinner. Another way that we culturally and emotionally detach from this idea is the language that we use. So the idea that we abstract the terminology that we use around meat in order to further make us not think of the animal while we're eating it. So the fact that we call beef beef instead of cow, the fact that we will eat veal instead of calf, although I probably wouldn't eat veal. And then there's the other kind of societal and cultural things around what kind of animals we eat. We don't tend to like the idea of eating animals that are smart or kind or friendly in some way. So I think most people in Western culture would agree that eating a cow is a lot easier than eating horse or dog. People might eat lamb, but they wouldn't eat ducklings or something like that. And I think that's just another way that we potentially abstract the reality of what we're doing from the end product which we are driven towards, which we're just kind of indoctrined into believing is the correct default. And then there's the idea which is coming into more prominence, but I still don't think is fully understood, around the impacts of this kind of diet on us as a species and on us individually. We know that eating more meat tends to lead to higher cholesterol, and processed meats tend to have more fat in them. And then there's the idea around these animals being treated so poorly that they get ill all of the time, so then they're fed antibiotics to keep them healthy, which then goes into our bloodstream as well, which makes us more antibiotic resistant, and also gets flushed out into the water and things like that. Again, I don't know the validity of all of these things. They are anecdotal. I would have to go and do a lot more research into it, but I think it's interesting to be aware of. I know that the cholesterol one is definitely linked, and heart disease and things like that are definitely linked with eating more red meat. So there is definitely a link there. How statistically significant it is, and for you as an individual, how significant that would be, would probably differ depending on the rest of your diet and what your diet looked like. But I think it is just another thing adding to the ever-growing list of potential reasons why the way that we eat meat and the culture that we live in around meat is probably not very healthy at the moment. I think for me personally, I've also noticed a decline in the quality of meat recently. And again, it might just be the supermarket that I shop at, but I definitely feel like the meat that we've bought recently has not lasted as long. It feels almost like it's pumped full of additional liquid in order to make it bigger and heavier, so it weighs more, so you pay more for it. I've noticed that, like, recently when I open a packet, especially of pork, it very much smells of pig, and I think that's really off-putting. And then there's a thing that I realized when a friend of mine started curing his own bacon a few years ago, which is that the color of bacon, the pink color of bacon, is not actually the natural color of bacon. It's kind of a slightly off grey color, which isn't particularly appetizing. And they deliberately dye it in order to make it look more like fresh meat, which is another little bizarre twist in making it look more palatable before you start eating it. So, to conclude this episode, I think for me personally, I'm not ready to shift to a fully plant based diet yet. I like the idea of potentially removing a lot more of the animal products from my diet and slowly transitioning to a more plant based diet with potentially saving meat and really high quality meat for celebrations. And when I do eat those products, to really cherish the place that they've come from and understand the sacrifice of creating that meal for me and taking more mindful steps towards paying attention to that. I think with all of these things, it comes down to awareness and challenging these ideas for yourself personally and how you feel about it. I also don't think that we necessarily have to live by these labels that are created. I don't need to sit in a category of vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian or any other label that's created. I can have a more nuanced opinion for myself around whether or not on a given day I feel like I want to eat a particular thing. And I don't have to, I'm not held by a rigid system where once I've given myself a label, then I have to stick to it, because otherwise I would be betraying the label and that pack or that community that I have put myself into. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether or not I've skipped anything. As I said at the beginning, this is a really emotive topic. So I expect that there will be quite a lot of strong emotions that have come up during me exploring these issues. And I think all of those emotions are absolutely fine. I would ask that if anybody was commenting, that they would be respectful of everybody else's beliefs. We are all on our own paths and our own journeys, and we shouldn't chastise or try to belittle anybody else for where they are on their path of discovery. I think if I would ask you to do one thing off the back of this, it would be examine your personal relationship with food and with animal-based products to see whether or not there is a juxtaposition between what you believe and what you're doing, and see if by challenging that it might uncover a different way of being that was more subtle and nuanced to you, rather than just following the default societal pattern of the way that everybody eats. So thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves. Until next time. Bye.